may get one or two more slip in, but I think we need to make a start. So I'm Nigel Brandon. I'm Vice Dean for Research in the Faculty of Engineering. I'm also going to be the next Dean of Engineering. And so, in particular, very interested and pleased to see the panel we've got today and the subject around diversity in engineering, which of course is so important. So I'm very keen to learn something. I know Hayaton from the Royal Academy, who's opening up our presentations. Now, just to let you all know, it is being recorded. So when we come to the question and answers, your questions will be recorded, just so you're aware of that. And if you could shout them out, because we don't have a roving mic, because it's only a small room, that would be good. So I'll introduce everyone as we get to them, I think, rather than sort of going up front. So Hayaton, if I could introduce you. So Hayaton's the Deputy CEO and Director of Strategy at the Royal Academy of Engineering, just down the road. And that's the premier academy for bringing together all of engineering across the UK and focusing on the value and benefit of engineering to society. So Hayaton's responsible for driving change in the academy and modernisation of the academy, and is the champion for diversity and inclusion within the Royal Academy of Engineering. So I can see the lift's just arrived, which is why I've got a flurry of people. So, Hayaton, over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Nigel, and thank you for inviting me to join your seminar today. Diversity and inclusion are topics in which I'm incredibly personally passionate, but they're also huge priorities for the Academy, for the Royal Academy of Engineering. So I'm delighted to have the opportunity to tell you a little bit about our work in this area and to fill you in a bit about the picture of diversity across engineering. So I've just set out here the very high-level visions for our overall programme. This is a programme that we run with BASE funding, with funding from the Department for Business, and it is a profession-wide programme, so we're running this on behalf of the wider engineering profession. Our vision is to create an inclusive engineering profession that can inspire, attract and retain, importantly, people from diverse backgrounds, and that's also reflective of the wider society in which we exist. I think it's just worth pointing out a couple of things. Although it's very, very easy to focus on gender when we think about diversity in engineering, we've taken a holistic view of diversity. So we include within that LGBTI, ethnicity, socioeconomic group, age, and disability, of course. And the other point I want to make is that when we moved from our first phase of this programme that finished in 2016 to the second phase, we explicitly decided to add the word inclusion. And that's because there's a sort of growing body of good practice that suggests that just focusing narrowly on diversity may be missing opportunities to engage a wider group of people. So inclusion can seem a slightly fuzzy word to use, but essentially, if you have an inclusive organisation, it's an organisation where you feel that you're valued, you have a sense of belonging, you feel you can bring your whole self to work, and where you feel that your role and your ability to be yourself is part of the success of the organisation. And I think what's very valuable is that whilst if you just focus about, for example, gender diversity, it can be quite disenfranchising to the majority, but everybody benefits from inclusion and everybody can help create an inclusive environment. So I've just set out here some of the high-level statistics. I must just give a slight caveat and say that unfortunately we suffer from a lack of consistent and comparable data sets in this area. So I'm showing you things that may not always be entirely consistent in terms of sources. But nonetheless, these give you a good high-level picture of what's going on. So 15% of engineering and technology undergraduates are women, which is a statistic that has been incredibly stubborn and has not changed significantly over more than a decade. 9% of professional engineers and technicians are women. So 9% of the professional engineering workforce in 2017 is made up of women. That's an extraordinary and very, very disappointing statistic. 3 to 7% of apprentices in engineering technology are women. Data on ethnicity is not as widespread as for gender, but 24% of engineering technology undergraduates come from Black and ethnic minorities, but only 6% of the engineering workforce are BME. We sadly don't have the data to be able to comment on the other underrepresented groups that are listed there. So I've also just picked out a few hastily cobbled together statistics that relate a bit more specifically to higher education. I thought that might be of interest. Statistics are a little better, but nothing to celebrate, I'm afraid. 17.7% of UK academic staff, according to HESA, are women, slightly higher for EU academic staff and also for non-EU academic staff, which may be interesting in light of some of the other wider changes that are happening. For doctorates in engineering disciplines, the number is about 20%. It varies, chemical and process do a little better. And then the only area where we could find publicly available data on BME for students was on taught postgraduate qualifications, where 27% of BME, so similar statistic to the one I just showed on the previous page. So let's put that in context. Again, caveated with the fact that these are not directly comparable statistics, but you can see a definite trend emerging here. The UK has the lowest percentage of female engineering professionals across the whole of Europe. We're bottom of the league. And the Academy did a study last year looking at 99 countries, a very diverse mix of countries. We've got 58 on gender parity. And here gender parity was defined as being the percentage of graduates, engineering graduates, who were women. A lot of work to do. We don't, unfortunately, have definitive evidence as to why the UK lags so far behind international comparators. So if we look at the engineering pipeline, we lose women at every stage. Physics. So the majority of engineering courses will require A-level physics, and you go from half of all the GCSE students being women in physics to 20% of A-level students, despite the fact that girls on average do better than boys at GCSE physics. So that's already starting us off on a bad footing. Then we also, if you look at the other end of the spectrum, if you look at women who go on maternity leave from engineering roles, only 2/3 of them do not return to their engineering roles after taking maternity leave. So problems right across the spectrum. I think it's also worth just pointing out that we do have a particularly gendered perception of engineering in the UK that seems to be a sort of culturally embedded characteristic. And that's an area where the Academy and colleagues across the profession are very anxious to make some changes. So particularly around influencing the influences of young people. It's all very well to give children in schools the opportunity to participate in experience engineering, but if they then go home and get negative feedback about the prospects of an engineering career, or even from their teachers or careers advisors, I think it's rather difficult to surmount that. So why does this matter? Well, I'm guessing that since all of you have come along to a seminar on diversity in engineering, to some extent I'm talking to the converted. But I think it is just worth putting in context. So it's commonly said the UK has an engineering skills crisis. You'll find there's a huge debate about the statistics that are associated with that. But very few people would argue that there is no engineering skills shortfall, and there are certainly major engineering skills gaps. The latest data from Engineering UK suggests that we're going to need 20,000 more engineers per annum at so-called level 4 plus, so should be HND and above, sorry. And that's already assuming levels of immigration that may or may not be possible in the future. So I think it's really impossible to tackle an engineering skills shortfall without tackling our diversity crisis. I think half the population is currently not participating, or the majority of half of that population. That's going to have to change for us to improve our engineering skills pipeline. But also, I think we have to, as a community, as an engineering community, have to ask what kind of engineering community, what kind of profession do we want to be part of? How do we make sure that engineering continues to be a really attractive profession for the most talented, the most able students? And that's something that I think is a responsibility we all share. There are, of course, other ways of framing the business case for diversity and inclusion, if you like. There are some stats here around the business benefits of having an organisation that has diversity and that is perceived as being inclusive. So these are just a subset of the statistics available. There are many more out there. I'm not going to go through them in detail. And there's also evidence that diverse teams where people's contributions are valued have high levels of creativity and innovation. So I'm just going to move quickly onto the Academy's programmes, just to give you a bit of a flavour of what we do. I won't have time to talk about much of the detail, but at least to just give you a sample of some of the things we do. So our programme splits across 3 different strands. There's one strand that's very focused on engaging with the professional engineering institutions, because of course they reach out into 450,000 professional engineers. So it's an ability to amplify the impact of what we're doing. We obviously need to work with engineering employers, and although that can mean industry, businesses, it could also mean higher education. I'll talk a little bit about work that interfaces with higher education. And then, of course, we have to make sure our own house is in order, so we have an internal work stream that's focused on making sure that the Academy's own activities are truly diverse and inclusive. So the first thing I'd like to just quickly talk about, before I go into the examples, just to say that we've cut our activities loosely up into 3 themes. One is using research and innovation to inspire and drive change. The second is using partnership. Partnership is very, very important for making sure that change gets disseminated and adopted more widely in the community. And of course, you have to communicate what you're doing, why it matters, and so forth. So one of the examples I'd like to quickly talk about is a study that we did, it was published at the end of last year, looking at the employment outcomes for engineering graduates. And we did this right across the engineering graduate cohort, but we also cut it up by gender and by ethnicity. So here you can just see a sort of a set of some of the headline findings. And it illustrates, when you're looking at the employment percentage, this is looking at the proportion of engineering graduates who transition into engineering employment 6 months after graduation. Now, arguably, we'd want those transition rates to be higher across all of those groups. But the proportion of BME graduates that don't transition is having a significant impact, actually, on the stats there for the male employment. So I'll come back to that in a second. And then if you look at the unemployment stats, what you can see just leaping out at you is that if you are a BME engineering graduate, you are more than twice as likely to be unemployed 6 months post-graduation than your white counterparts. It's a very uncomfortable statistic, I think. And that applies even if you have the same class of degree and you have been to a Russell Group university. So there are obviously other factors that could be affecting that, but we have control for those. So one of the things the Academy is doing in response to that is a higher education, what we call employer engagement pilot, where we're working with 13 companies and over 300 students who come from multiple underrepresented groups to try to see if we can create better outcomes, having more of these underrepresented groups choosing to pursue engineering careers and opening the employers' minds to the benefits of having students who don't come necessarily from the likes of Imperial and don't have a 2-1 or above in their degree class. And it's early days, but so far the results are encouraging. I think that's one to watch. There's a theory that social capital is behind some of these discrepancies. Social capital being the kind of tacit knowledge and values that are shared across groups in society that make it easy to navigate, for example, social situations or interview situations. Just the ability to know what to expect when you apply for the graduate intake. Those are the sorts of things that by working with underrepresented groups, disenfranchised groups, we're trying to see if we can change, but this is ongoing work. Another thing I thought would just be worth mentioning is our diversity inclusion progression framework. I'm sure that most people in this room will be familiar with Athena Swan. This is a bit different. This is a tool that we developed for the engineering professional institutions to use as a way of assessing their own maturity in diversity inclusion matters. So it's based around self-assessment, but it's a common framework, and we do a common data collection exercise so that we can benchmark the community as a whole. And it covers all dimensions of diversity, so it's not limited to gender. And it's a very intuitive, easy-to-use tool that could be used at the level of a group. It could be used at the level of a department. It's not hugely labour-intensive to do, and there's a digital toolkit that supports it. So it's something that you might find useful. The way we've cut it up for the professional engineering institutions is to use these 8 themes. Not all of those would relate to a group or a department, but many of them actually would be relevant. And then there's a simple maturity model where you for each of those criteria, you look at whether you feel that you are predominantly at level 1, 2, 3, or 4. And of course, over time, you aim to move along that maturity model. It's something that might be of use, and I'm very happy if anyone's interested in knowing more to talk further. And then the last example I just wanted to give you is our Inclusive Cultures project. So one of the difficulties in talking about inclusion is it does seem a bit amorphous. It's a bit difficult to pin down. How do you know whether you're an inclusive organisation? And how do we know as an engineering profession whether we're an inclusive profession? So the Inclusive Cultures project is something that we have done on the basis of, we've This is a project to establish a baseline. We aim to define what inclusion means for engineering and to establish a baseline against which we can hopefully measure progress. So just under 7,000 companies responded to our survey. Quite a detailed survey. People have given up a lot of time to do this. And it's interesting that I think over 80% of those are older white males. So it's going to give us a great insight into how the majority group in the profession feel about inclusion. So I think the very fact that 80% of those people, of those nearly 7,000 people, were from the majority group and bothered to complete the survey is a very, very encouraging statistic. So the project should help us understand what the current culture is, how people experience it, and how we can be more inclusive in the future. What we want to do ultimately is to be able to develop very practical actions that people will feel as relevant to their business objectives, and to make sure that we do this in a way that shares the best practice and knowledge that's developing around the community so that we can all make progress faster. So that's all I wanted to say by way of introduction to our programmes. I'm very happy to answer questions in the Q&A, obviously, and if anyone wants to follow up with me, please feel free to get in touch. My details are up there. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Hayat, I'm sure there'll be plenty of questions to follow, but we're going to save all of that for the panel that's going to come. So if I could invite Rob Priestley to come forward. So Rob's an associate professor and director of graduate studies in the Department of Chemical and Biological Engineering at Princeton, and a director of the Princeton's associate director of the Center for Complex Materials there. So Rod's going to give us a bit of a US comment and a bit of US perspective.
Sure.
Is that correct? And no slides, just no a verbal comment. You can stand here if you want, or you can sit down there if you want, whatever works for you.
Right,
so over to you, Rod.
All right, I appreciate it. So I don't know if it's going to be quite the US perspective, but certainly a little bit of my perspective coming from Princeton University. And so it's going to be relatively informal. I didn't prepare any slides, but certainly there's some comments I'd like to make. First off, certainly thank you for the opportunity to speak with you all and share with you all some of my thoughts on diversity. And I'd like to start with that by saying that Princeton University itself, I believe, was founded in 1776, right, with the School of Engineering actually being formed somewhere around 1900. Well, in 2009, the university and the School of Engineering hired their first African-American faculty member. That happened to be me. And since then, since 2009, the university hasn't hired any more African-American faculty members in the School of Engineering. Okay? So it's certainly not a problem that just exists in the UK. It certainly exists in the United States and even at Princeton. Now, one can ask, well, why is that the case? And I'd like to just be quite direct. And I think the reason why the academy is not diverse is because the faculty don't want it to be. And I think that's the truth. And in fact, there was an article published a few years back with the exact same title, Why is the Academy Not Diverse? And the conclusion was that the faculty didn't want it to be. And the response that this faculty member got back from this post was actually quite, the author received about 5,000 responses, all from faculty, with faculty emails, and so she could identify them. About half of those responses were positive in the sense that, oh, you're absolutely correct, I didn't know I had these biases. But the other half were actually horrible in the sense that they were stating, well, we are biased for these particular reasons. We're biased because these people or these certain groups of people aren't qualified to be at our particular institution. And in fact, this person stated to me that the harshest email actually came from a Princeton professor. So she actually reposted that email in the Washington Post, so you can actually go and find that. But in fact, so as I mentioned, I was hired at Princeton as assistant professor in 2009. But how did I get there? How did I get to be in science? In fact, I would say that perhaps the most important program in my career trajectory was something called the Ronald McNair Scholars Program. Okay, it's named after Ronald McNair, who was an astronaut who died in the shuttle Challenger in 1986. Okay, that program was designed for first-generation college students, low-income college students, as well as underrepresented minorities. Okay, of which I happened to fit all three, and so I was able to participate in that program. From that program, I got to do undergraduate research with the mentor of mine, Greg McKenna, at Polymer Science on physical aging. That was my first experience in research, and from that, it excelled me to continue to do research. That program will likely be cut in the current budget, and so that program will no longer exist, and so we're going to see simply a reduction in these outreach programs, okay? But with that being said, as the first speaker alluded to, we clearly know the power of diversity. We certainly understand that diverse groups, when compared to non-diverse groups, can outperform in numerous ways, certainly in creativity, etc. And that's exactly why us as scientists are likely trying to work at the interdisciplinary boundaries between, say, the life sciences, the physical sciences and biology, because we know that we learn mostly from people that we know least, that we have least in common with, and that's true when you also work across different disciplines as well. I'd like to say that the other component related to interdisciplinary, say, science, is the human capital, okay? And we certainly need to add that component to the convergence of these disciplines, all right? I believe that's extremely important. Certainly there is a thought out there that brilliant folks can come up with ideas by themselves, but I'd like to think that innovation, and most of us in here are engineers, that innovation is really a social problem, okay? And we certainly need diverse groups to actually solve these social problems, okay? And with that being said, oftentimes when I make such comments, the first question that would come up would be the abilities comment, okay? Do we essentially abandon meritocracy? And clearly the answer to that question is no, okay? Abilities certainly do matter. But I think the point that we're trying to get across here is that diversity matters equally as important as well. Okay, and so these things shouldn't be viewed as competition of one another, but they are both actually quite important. Now, to the point of abilities, I think that's one that's very important, and here's why I'd like to, I guess, begin to make a distinction between diversity on the one hand and underrepresentation on the other hand. For instance, in my own department, on any given day, you might hear 5 or 6 languages. And I haven't done the math, but you might have people from 7 or 8 different countries, okay? That's true across the faculty. It's even more diverse at the graduate level, and it's even more diverse at the undergraduate level. So at some hand, one can say that the university is doing quite well in terms of diversity. Where it is not doing well, that is in terms of underrepresented groups. And I'm defining these groups as those who have been historically disenfranchised by their own country, okay? Those who have been systematically discriminated against. And that's in fact why you have these differences in abilities. And I think the programs that we're trying to develop are the ones that are targeting addressing these abilities and these differences. And so, with that being said, I certainly would like to point out, I guess, a few programs that I think are quite successful. The first of which is what's called the Bell Laboratories Fellowship. And so this is not a program that existed at Princeton, but if you do a survey of the most successful, say, minority scientists and engineers across the United States, you'll see that about 50% of them or so probably have been touched by this Bell Laboratory Fellowship program, okay? And so it was run out of Bell Laboratories. Some of you probably heard of Bell Laboratories in New Jersey. And there were several key components to that program that I think academic institutions should take a note of. The first of which is that diversity and inclusion, from what I understand, became actually part of the performance review. Okay, and so it became part of a scientist review. Are you working with diverse faculty, or excuse me, diverse scientists and students? Are you trying to recruit them, etc.? Because oftentimes one of the comments we get is that, well, it's actually quite time consuming to go out and do recruiting and try and bring in diverse groups of students into your labs, and the universities are not appreciating that. And so I think one of the things that academic institutions can certainly do is begin to make this actually part of the annual review process, okay? In my own department, I was introduced as becoming the DGS, and so I take over that role, Director of Graduate Studies in my department, on July 1st, okay? We've had very wonderful directors of graduate studies in my department, but for various reasons, we have not had a diverse graduate student body. And I'd argue that part of that reason is not that the faculty members don't care, but they just don't have the time. And they likely view that the university is not judging their performance on how well they do in this particular area, so they're not valuing it as something that they need to do, okay? The other thing that the Bell Laboratories Fellowship program recognizes is that they had to develop a community, okay? Very often, places get comfortable if they hire, say, 1 or 2 underrepresented minorities, but in fact, that's just not enough. You actually need a community of scholars if you want to become an inclusive environment that was mentioned. earlier, okay? And then the other key component, and this may be more U.S. specific, is that the Bell Laboratories Fellowship Program actually involved minority scientists. Okay? A lot of the programs that are being run in the United States, for better or worse, are not involving actual minority scientists in their programs. They're run by very capable people who have very good intentions, but they are not involving actually minority scientists in these programs, and I think that's extremely important for the success of the programs. Another comment I like to make, I guess with respect to Princeton, is that the university certainly has to recognize its shortcomings, diversity and underrepresentation. And it just completed a 18-month study. So a very long study in which there was a committee of about 15 or so faculty and graduate students and administrators. And what they did was they actually visited probably a dozen or so universities and other institutions to actually learn about the best practices and what other institutions were in fact doing. That study actually just wrapped up this summer. The university will be submitting its report this summer. And what they intend to do is actually create, or the goal is to actually create a national program. So they want to have a program that actually has national reach. And so there are several programs in the United States that has national reach. For instance, there's a program called the Meyerhoff program at the University of Maryland, Baltimore County, that seemingly graduates probably about 20% of all black PhDs in the United States. Okay, and so Princeton has ambitions to develop a program very much like that. They are envisioning developing what's been termed essentially a pipeline program. So they don't want to say just target one particular group, say graduate students, and then transfer them into faculty, or high school students and then help them get into college. They actually want to target the entire pipeline. And so it's envisioned that this is going to be a relatively large program where they want to hire several outside administrators and staff to actually run this program. So I'm very much looking forward to the university bringing that program on board. I think it's going to be extremely beneficial to the university. So with that being said, I certainly like to wrap up. Again, thanks for giving me an opportunity to share a few comments with you all. I didn't get really too personal on my background. In the Q&A, if people have any specific questions, I'd be happy to address those. But I think Imperial having this event is already a sign in and of itself. Thank you.
Rob, thanks very much. So we're just going to invite our other two panel members to say a few words. So Katherine, if I could ask you to come first. So Katherine Brehm is Head of Science at Bayes and covers energy and climate change. And prior to that, you were Global Head of Sustainable Finance Solutions in Australia at ANZ. So do you want to stand there and then the mic will pick you up a bit better? But just a few comments and then you can take a seat and then I'll get the other panel members up as well.
Well, thank you to the Royal Academy and to Imperial for hosting this event. It's a real pleasure to be here today as our ministers are being confirmed over the course of this week. So my comments will be very much in the spirit of my experience and not a government position. But with that in mind, I thought I'd share a little bit of my experience from Australia and women in engineering there. I did chemical engineering a long time ago. And you'll see I've moved careers. I've worked in McKinsey and before government in the financial services sector. So as an engineer, it's fair to say you can do a lot of different things in your career, and I've been very fortunate to have done that. I'm just going to share with you a couple of experiences from supporting women and engineers in Australia and some of the programs I was involved in there and at ANZ, because I think the diversity and inclusion thing is really important, and there are similarities to learn across different sectors in banking, arguably, as well as engineering. And then some of what we're doing internally within Bayes and across the science and engineering profession that you might be interested to hear more about or get involved with. I graduated from Queensland Uni, and there is the Executive Dean of Engineering there is Professor Simon Biggs, who some of you may know at the Royal Academy, is a fellow here and is from Leeds University. And when he joined the faculty there, he was surprised again that the diversity and inclusion wasn't, a great emphasis, because he said, the engineers of tomorrow are going to be problem solvers. And I really do believe that. I think engineering gives you the skill sets to think about, you've got stuff coming in and stuff going out, whether that's a policy, whether that's a major materials process, how you solve for those big problems. That's the skills engineers have. And so he asked me to get involved in a program they've got to encourage more women into engineering. When I did engineering, I think there was 9% women, 7%. Now in Australia, at UQ, there's 23% as of 2016. The national average is 17%. So it's better than it was when I did engineering, but it's still got a long way to go. And so Simon has this target of having a third of engineers, women, graduates by 2023, which is quite a challenging target, because you don't want to poach other professions as well. So how do you... And so what we started to do was some work around going out to schools, so talking to schools, which is something our perm second base is also asking us as civil servants to do, to talk about the real world problems that you're dealing with as an engineer. And so women, I think, still, many girls have this perception of what they see in the media as an engineer is in a hard hat in a mine and who wants to go live in a mine, as opposed to creating, dealing with sustainable food production, creating the new materials of the future, electric vehicles. So it's that broad perception, I think, is actually still probably an issue in the media. So when I talk about my career to some of the students, I'm really surprised at how diverse that could be. So education, supporting them through, so acknowledging that they might come from that different background, encouraging them to do the physical sciences at school is really important, so they don't narrow their options, they can actually then choose to do engineering. And the third was around connections, and the program that they've set up at UQ is sponsored by the major employers in Brisbane, Rio Tinto and Origin and others. It's once a month or once every 2 months they would have drinks and they invite students in so they can see professionals in the workforce as they're going through their degree, and that then provides those links to the graduate programs, which probably, you can create those informal networks, which is just as important. When I was at ANZ, just to come on to a second example, similar issues in the finance sector in that, as women, there was a study done that I think women had to work on an extra 7 to 9 years to catch up after they've been on maternity leave. Because you go on maternity leave, you have 12 months off, your colleague gets promoted ahead of you, and you never catch up. And so there's a lot of work being done in Australia around just disclosure on salaries and promotions, and getting these, they're called male champions of change, or these CEOs said, it's more than just being a mentor, you have to sponsor. And I think that idea of, I see a great woman, she's going on maternity leave, but I'm going to promote her at the point she comes back, most people had never thought about or started to think about. And not just women, but also thinking about the whole diversity point within that. And data is really important in this space. So collecting data so you can have baselines, and that in itself is revealing. So you can have those conversations. As my male boss said to me, everyone's always asked me for a pay rise, you're not. Ask me for a pay rise. And so now I encourage most of the people in my employ to say, I've got another job that's 15% more, why aren't you giving me that? And so I think there is something around that kind of encouragement point as well, and sponsorship, but being honest with yourselves with the data that you're collecting and what does that mean. And some of the companies in Australia are now publishing that, and it's having a big impact. So that's the second area. And if I just come on to my current role, I feel very privileged to have my role. I love my title, Head of Science and Maze. It's fantastic. Around climate and energy. It's a tricky area at the moment, but it's really important. And so I think there's, Sir Mark Warport, who heads up our CSA network, has created, there's a group of the CSAs that are looking at the whole science and engineering profession and what more we can do to support civil service and growth of that profession. And there are 3 or 4 areas in particular. So one is around skills and working with the Royal Academies around ensuring that, our scientists and engineers keep up their qualifications and learning. That's a really important aspect of what we do. And supporting people through that process, so allowing them the time to do that CPD work. The second is there's a formal mentoring program, so there's a STEM mentoring program, but other programs that they support around mentoring, which I think is important. So I'm a mentor for a number of women in the department, but also outside the department, so it's important to have that cross-industry collaboration. The third area is this recognition of specialist skills in decision making, and this goes back to, I think your point was made earlier around problem solving and diversity. Traditionally, the civil service has made decisions for evidence and policy a lot around policy input and the economist analytical support. So with FACE coming together, we've now, through our evidence board process, which John Loughead, our CSA, chairs, we've got people around that table from science, engineering, economist backgrounds. And so in our research committees, I'm going to one this afternoon, it's actually really good where you've got an economist looking at a question from an economist point of view, but actually having the engineer to say, well, will that work in practice, or where's that going to be applied, I think is really important. And so that's increasing, might not be changing the outcome, but it's starting the questioning process from a different way. And so in signing off of analytical work, which I need to do, for example, with the greenhouse gas inventory, you do need that diversity. You do need that problem solving to get a better outcome, I think. I guess the final thing I would just say is that in terms of the day-to-day things and what can I do to influence diversity, I'm very conscious now in decision making. So we're putting together at the moment a committee for making recommendations on spending in a number of energy innovation areas. And I looked at that committee makeup when we first set it up with all the people that had recommended to me, and it was all male. And it was all the same figures. And I was like, well, that's not going to work. And so they said, but there's no one in those jobs. I said, but we're about making decisions. So let's bring in, so we brought some people in from another department. We brought in an economist who, I made sure we got the female economist who's brilliant. So I think you can question yourself, and there are those points to do that. So, you know, what is my internal target is probably 30% as well, and so I'm aiming for that in what I do. And I have those small opportunities to influence, but you need to think about that on a day-to-day basis, and question yourself around that, be honest about that as well. So if there's, you know, three things I'd say is problem solving, that's why this matters, diversity and inclusion. The second is confidence building, so what can we do to sponsor people more than just mentor. And the third, I think, is really important, and it's not just important for females, though it's often talked about in this context, is flexibility in the workforce. So I would say 80% of my team work flexibly, and we make it work because they're professionals. But it's just as important for the men as for the women, because they need to get home to be with families, or they need to do whatever they need to do as well. And I think if you can start to have that conversation in an inclusive way, that makes for a motivated workforce, that you trust them to get on and do the job they need to do, but they do it when they can. So thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, take a seat, Catherine, and I'll ask Richard Gunn to come up and just say a few words as well. So Richard's the lead for equality, diversity and inclusion at EPSRC and head of advanced materials and peer review, and you've been there the last 5 years. You also had some time with the Parliamentary Office of Science and Technology, it says. So Richard, we're interested in your thoughts, and then we'll ask everyone to come up to the front.
I've also got Jericho Braille, sorry.
Oh, have I missed you off my list? Well, in that case, I've got you on my list. So carry on, and I'll let's add you onto my list quite a lot, Richard.
Okay, so thanks very much for the invitation to come and speak to you today and come back to Imperial. I'll try and pick up on some of the points made by previous speakers, and I'll try and keep this brief so we can have some time for questions. To come back to how we frame this, one thing that I'll note straight away is that although I'm an employee of EPSRC, the research councils are actually working in partnership on all of our equality, diversity and inclusion initiatives. And it's important to note that the Research Council is an employer of researchers as well as a funder of researchers, so we can offer perhaps a slightly unique perspective. I don't have time to talk about everything that we're doing, but if you go online and look up our Equality, Diversity and Inclusion Action Plan, you can see some of what the research councils are currently doing in this area. Why are we doing it? So I suppose the bottom line from the Research Council perspective is that for the UK to continue to be a successful research nation, we absolutely have to harness all of our talent. And perhaps to tie some threads together, the research councils have been very keen on advocating this notion of responsible research and innovation in recent years, and I'd absolutely agree with the previous speakers that actually diversity is a prerequisite for responsible innovation and actually for the legitimacy of researchers in wider society as well. Coming back to some of the points that were raised earlier, I think a number of the speakers have talked about data already, and Hyton presented some quite sobering statistics. I have similar statistics. The situation is very similar across engineering and physical sciences. But one of the great challenges for us really, I think, is how can we kind of work together to kind of share that data and really understand the situation with respect to equality and diversity in EPS. So for example, 7% of Research Council applicants don't disclose their ethnicity to the Research Councils when they apply. So we're interested in working very closely in partnership with the relevant societies, with research organisations, and working with the other research councils, we've set up a body which we're calling the University Partnerships Framework. This is a group of, I think, about 10 institutions that have been picked because they're representative of the breadth of UK higher education, and that actually involves Imperial College. And we're meeting with them later this week to discuss how we share data, how universities can give us additional insight into what's going on and vice versa. So this is very much kind of a collaborative programme of activities. Another activity to look out for is we'll be launching a £5 million call later this year called Inclusion Matters, and that's to fund pilot projects looking at how we can accelerate this process of kind of long-term cultural change in EPS research. Something that the organisers asked me if I could talk about specifically was anonymous peer review, and I'd like to set that in the context of a wider piece of work that we're doing at the moment, again in partnership with other research councils. And this is around really challenging potential bias in our review processes and kind of safeguarding fair and inclusive decision making. And for the last 18 months or so, EPSRC has been working with a firm of psychologists to kind of have a look at our, in detail at our peer review and assessment processes and our employment processes, how we can kind of make sure that people aren't introducing sources of bias into those processes and raise awareness of where those biases might lie. So that's resulted in a number of different things. We now have additional training for all of our staff that are involved in peer review on potential bias in decision making. So that covers everything from kind of how you run a panel to ensure that panel members are rested and avoid cognitive kind of overload. Unconscious bias, and we're rolling out unconscious bias training now both to our internal staff and our reviewers, and that will be compulsory for panel members sitting on Research Council panels. That's due to launch very soon. So there's been a whole suite of work working around that. And in fact, one interesting insight that we've introduced into our processes is the principle of fairness is now enshrined as one of our principles of peer review. And in fact, working with the psychologists, the evidence suggests that just by noting that an assessment process should be considered fairly actually does have an impact on the way people think about it during the review process. Anonymous peer review is something that was specifically highlighted. I'm quite new into this role, and I was quite surprised that when I spoke to my colleagues, they assured me that EPSRC has actually been using anonymous peer review since 2001. So we've been doing this for a number of calls over the years, and mainly in a series of calls that some of you may be familiar with called the Big Pitch. So these are kind of relatively small, around £250,000 proposals aimed at kind of transformative, high-risk new ideas, and these involve an anonymous outline stage. We had another pilot project last year looking at a call on distributed ledger technology, which we ran with an anonymous outline stage. And what we're currently doing, and I'm afraid I don't have any insight into this at the moment, but it's going back over all of our data where we've used anonymous peer review in the past and trying to see if we can see any trends in how that might be influencing kind of diversity issues with respect to the people that we've funded and the people that have applied. So I'd be very interested to hear of anyone's experiences, either as an applicant or a reviewer, based on an anonymous peer review process. There are some challenges for us, so there's there's how you actually handle the anonymisation, which creates potentially extra workload. There's, I suppose, a philosophical debate really over how much you can separate sometimes the idea from the person, and how you make sure that in perhaps small multidisciplinary fields people aren't inadvertently kind of giving away their identity. And so for our pilot calls we've used what we call perceived conflicts of interests. So in the recent distributed ledger call we essentially asked the panel to leave the room where they thought they might have a conflict of interest. Interestingly, that was invoked 3 times, and actually we think only one of those conflicts was a substantive conflict. But as far as we're aware, nothing was kind of missed. As I say, the results are slightly inconclusive. The feedback we've had from panel members at least is that they have found this quite a helpful process in terms of reducing the cognitive load on the panel members and kind of separating out the different assessment criteria and perhaps being able to apply them slightly more objectively. So we're going to continue to look at that, and as I say, if anyone has any experiences with that process that they'd like to share, I'd be very happy to discuss them with you.
Thank you. Okay, so Jericho, if I could ask Jericho Braille to say a few things. He's a reader in chemical engineering here, and he tells me he's the first male recipient of the L.C. Widdowson Fellowship, and he's done a shared parental leave in 2016 after the birth of twins. So, busy man. Okay.
Thank you, Nigel. So I'll keep it brief because I know we need time for questions. So I guess diversity and inclusion is a topic very close to my heart. I was admissions tutor in chemical engineering for a number of years, and I was a hall warden as well for 8 years. So I've seen many thousands of undergraduate students coming through our guest department and home, really. And then I guess one of the reasons I'm here is that back in, just over a year ago, twins Martha and Thomas were born, and we are, I guess, an unusual couple still. We're a same-sex couple, and I was very surprised, genuinely surprised, to see how supportive the college was as a whole, in fact, to the point that exceeded my expectations significantly. So, for example, as I approached HR, the attitude was to arrange a meeting, sit down together, and rather than see how the formalities fitted with our specific requirements, the attitude was genuinely, we will make this work. How can we make that work? And the same thing applied within our own department, for example. And I think the first, my first expectation would be, the rules will be bent such that we can be accommodated. And instead, I was very happily surprised, without mentioning anyone, that the attitude was instead that, perhaps the rules need to change to be able to accommodate this. So let's not find any kind of backdoor to make this accessible or possible. No, let's make sure that we can change those rules. And so Imperial is, I think, very visionary, and we are fortunate to have this a number of mechanisms to support staff, and I think Katherine mentioned the return to work, which is very important. And one of these mechanisms is this L.C. Widdowson Fellowship. L.C. Widdowson is a distinguished female scientist, and until, I guess, my case, this fellowship had been awarded to allow female staff to return sort of with hitting the ground running, returning from maternity leave. And of course, it's named after a female scientist, and it has a number of rules in terms of time off and gender, etc. And very rapidly, those were formally changed. And I'm very, I guess, flattered that would have happened with my circumstances. But very fortunate that this is now available also to everyone. And while I have never really been very interested in, excessively sort of publicizing my case or so forth, I feel that I now have a kind of real responsibility, and that derives from the sort of the gratitude that for the support that I've received. And so I've realized that I can no longer just sort of keep to my research and teaching and fundraising, the things that I care, I guess, perhaps innately for, but I have this additional responsibility that I intend to sort of keep up. And of course, this with my roles in admissions and as a hall warden, I realize that evidently, and a number of us have mentioned that we've all to benefit for having a diverse workforce, but also a visibly diverse workforce that is more likely to attract, I guess, a broader spectrum of talent, and that will, of course, benefit the community as a whole. So I'm very pleased to be part of this panel. Thanks, Nigel.
If I could ask Ayrton and Rod to join us. We have some minutes, not too many minutes, but some minutes for any questions that you might have. I'd just like to thank everyone, right? I think it's reflective of, I hope, the importance we all see around the subject, that we have such an interesting and high-quality panel here today with government representation, funder representation, academic representation, and a professional academy engineering representation. So it's a really interesting opportunity. Don't have to ask questions formally now. There's an opportunity to do, but we also have a networking opportunity if you'd rather ask those questions privately or in person after we've after we've had this session. So are there any questions for any members of the panel to kick us off? Okay, well,
No, you go first.
Omar, shout it out because then the mics will pick it up.
Right, so it's really a question for Ron. When you joined Princeton, what was the feeling that you had? What were the vibes that you were picking up around the department and the engineering quadrangle generally? Did you feel alone, or did you actually feel welcome? Or is this a question you could answer later?
I guess certainly part of it I can answer later. But I guess let me touch, I guess, on the bigger issue of environment and culture. I think one of the perspectives I have for Princeton and what it can do is, as you know, Princeton is a well-resourced institute, and I think, given the current numbers that have been shown already for the UK, but for the US, what that really means is that not every institution can win and have high numbers right away. But certainly institutions with resources should be able to do much better, and Princeton is one of those institutions, and it hasn't done much better. So there has to be a reason for that. The other component, I think, related to resources is, as you alluded to, is culture and climate. And from my own perspective and background, it doesn't matter, what Princeton says they're going to do, what they want to do, how they use their resources, no matter how much they have. The idea of being a welcoming environment and one that's inclusive can't be faked. And I think whether or not you're a high school student or you are a faculty member, you can see right through that. You can see right through whether or not an institution or a person, for that matter, is being quite genuine. And one of the things I think that all the successful programs in the United States have in common is that the people that are running them are genuine, and the students can feel that. And for the programs that are not, it's clearer that it's just lip service, and they can feel that right away when they walk on campus. In my particular case, I work in materials. Princeton has a materials research center. They have very distinguished faculty in computational sciences that I thought I can complement, that I thought could complement my experiments, and I thought it was an opportunity, that I couldn't pass, but then also one where I thought my presence there was extremely important at the time for both undergraduate students and graduate students. And then also I think the opportunity was ripe for me to have the opportunity to make change.
Okay, thanks. I don't know if anyone else on the panel wants to comment about inclusivity and sense of...
I was going to just take the advantage to just pick up on something that came up earlier, so forgive me, I'm not really answering your question, Omar. But the point that was made around this feeling of tension between excellence and diversity and inclusion, I just wanted to pick up on, because it's something, of course, that at the Royal Academy of Engineering we've had to think quite hard about. And I think there are sort of two key actions that help here. One is taking responsibility for the pipeline. So, of course, it takes time for things to change, but we certainly have got to a point where we really take a much higher degree of ownership for the fact that there aren't enough people who are ready to necessarily be appointed at a particular point in time. So, working hard to populate your pipeline at an earlier time and earlier stage, and to feel that that is an inherent part of your responsibility has been an important learning for us. And the other thing is, this unconscious bias piece that was mentioned by a couple of colleagues is so important. there's a really good body of evidence that higher education STEM departments are just as susceptible to unconscious bias, for example, in recruitment. That literally if you change the name on a CV to be a male or a female one or an ethnic minority one, you change not just who the panel would choose to appoint, but how much they're willing to pay them, how much they're willing to invest in them. So I just think, one of the most helpful things that we can all remind ourselves is everybody's subject to unconscious bias. We're all making assumptions about each other all the time. And just that sort of, we're all on the same level here, and we're all as guilty as anyone else of making assumptions is a useful reminder. I think it's very easy to just feel that unconscious bias is something that happens to other people. So the sorts of measures that Richard is building at EPSLC we're mirroring very much at the Academy, and I think they apply very much to higher education as well. And then I suppose the third, that's a slightly more, it's a less specific action, but it's relevant too, is just checking how we define excellence. So in engineering, we often have a discussion about the extent to which, for example, in the wider research community, research that results in real-world application, uptake, commercial impact, societal impact is recognised as excellent in the same way as research that results in incredibly high citation levels. And so I think we can just apply that same challenge to ourselves when we think about the excellence that we're looking at, for example, when recruiting or when deciding who to put forward for a particular prestigious grant. So I just thought I'd share those because those are things that we've, like Richard, been thinking quite hard about.
Thanks, Hayton. Does anyone else on the panel want to add to that? Otherwise, we can go to Jane's question.
I had a point to add actually on this additional responsibility I think that certain institutions have, and I felt, for example, when in my role as admissions tutor, that I would often get invitations to come and speak at schools for so physics clubs, engineering clubs, science clubs, and as a single person running an admissions process, you have to balance a number of responsibilities and time. And I realized that, of course, and perhaps unsurprisingly to all of us, I would only get invitations from the top schools. I will not name them, this and they're being recorded, and I would be very often very happy to oblige, and often that would be a very pleasant experience because the students were keen, they would ask great questions, and I would come from this experience quite happy and willing to do it again. And no, I would very rarely, in fact, never have received an invitation from an underperforming school or a WP school, a widening participation school. But occasionally, under the auspices perhaps of the IKME, we would take part in events that involved other schools. And that experience was a lot harder. And I was kind of ashamedly, they were not, these encounters were not initiated by me. And I felt really that we were, as an institution and personally, that I was really underserving our mission in terms of widening participation. There's one thing which is to consider the list, the kind of tick box in the UCAS form that says maybe this is a WP person, and you use some kind of maybe flexibility that maybe is decided within your colleagues, but there isn't the kind of seeding the pipeline that Hayton was mentioning that comes at GCSE level and so forth, at that transition from GCSE to A level. And collectively, I think that me personally, but us as a cohort, we really can do a lot better. And I think you'll find a lot of the staff would be genuinely able to, in small parts, contribute to that effect.
Sure. And it's going to be really interesting, I think, in terms of our new campus in White City and the explicit opportunities to engage with the local community, which is actually quite in parts not a high, it's an underrepresented group, to see how they engage with the facilities that we've offered, and to come in and actually get local people working and young people working and giving them opportunities to make things and engage in the practical aspects of science and engineering. I think that should be, I hope, very exciting. We'll see. I know that Jane raised her hand. Is that Jeff? Did you want to comment?
No, not on that. A separate question, really, if you allow, which is that I think, I'm targeted primarily at Hayton, but other members, is that we treat sort of engineering as one uniform discipline, but actually when we look at the admissions technique, statistics across the Faculty of Engineering here, we see vast differences between specific disciplines. For example, our new design engineering course achieved 50%,
absolutely, it's a great
gender
example.
divide in its first year. our bioengineering department does well, civil engineering does well, but mechanical engineering, electrical engineering, computing science, they're 15% or less. I mean, have you any view on that?
Yeah, it's a really good point, Jeff. So I've obviously in a short space of time, you give a kind of very superficial slice across, but actually the same points you're making also apply to the issues around diversity, because we all have multiple identities. There's a big trend within diversity inclusion around intersection, and the fact that just talking about women or just talking about black people doesn't actually capture where the real pinch points are, and perhaps some of the the key barriers that people in different groups face. And there's an interesting book by a lady called Pooja Sachdev, who talks about how multiple identities ought to shape the way we approach diversity and inclusion. And one of the things that she argues for is that rather than just having global goals, you look within an organisation and see what's working well, where can we find a department that's bucking the trend, and how do we really draw the learning from that. So I think in the design course, one of the, as I understand it, one of the innovations that could be very interesting is the looser requirements, if you like, for A-level subjects.
We were willing to be relaxed about physics, which I think has...
Exactly, and UCL have done in civil engineering something similar. So I think it's absolutely right. When you look just at the global picture, you miss these really important details that sometimes give you the best opportunities for learning and for spreading that good practice.
I'll just see if the rest of the panel want to add any. Does anyone else want to add anything on that? Because I think we probably do need to wrap up. Jane can take a question in person because we got some lunch and then people need to move on. So does anyone else on the panel want to respond on that or make any other closing remarks? I'll just go through you. Rod, do you want to make any response or final closing remarks, and I'll move down the line?
Sure. I guess I'll make two very brief comments. I think one related to peer review and anonymous peer review, and I think there was a study published recently, or an article published recently in Science, a magazine that focused on anonymous peer review by the NIH, and in that article that there was clear bias, and it was towards identifying somebody's name, whether or not it sounded African American or Hispanic or not, and there was a clear distinction in outcomes of the review process. And so I do believe that is in fact true. The other final comment that I'll make is in terms of abilities, and I think at least this is true in the U.S. In terms of high school students going off to college and taking SAT and ACT exams. That the only metric that correlates with scores is family income, and certainly family income is certainly reflective of one's opportunities, and so I think that's an important point to recognize.
Thanks. Ciao.
I think, perhaps as a summary point, I feel that as a community of engineers, we're privileged in that we've been educated, I think, considerably more than the average. I think that we should embrace this idea of an additional responsibility that we might not necessarily have in faring well above par compared to others. And coupled to this, I think there's a collective feeling that many of the headways that we've made in terms of diversity, whether it's with gender equality, BME, LGBT, and so forth, I think there's a sense, certain complacence between us that things are getting better and they will continue to get better. And I think that the current political climate, both in the UK and overseas, isn't as such, and that we have therefore an increasing responsibility to make sure that as guardians of what we've been handed over, that we will continue to do, considerably better. Because I don't think this idea that this is pretty much a guaranteed outcome for the coming decades isn't quite true. So I would like us to challenge us to think of that.
Could I ask a question about that? Because we focus a lot on process, and sometimes I think maybe we should be more aggressive on targets. Because I noticed that. You mentioned the Queensland one and actually your own, and I think sometimes, even if they're not explicit, we should have an end in mind, not just. I think we're doing quite well on process, but I think there's still a lot to be done. So if you felt that would be a way of waking us up from a bit of a slumber and a sort of complacency to say, actually, let's start being a bit more explicit on actual numbers.
Absolutely, I think many of us mentioned the importance of data.
Absolutely. Our society in the UK, have to make it actually reflect what the UK actually looks like.
Absolutely.
And that's a way of sort of dealing with that.
Absolutely right.
Okay, thanks, Neil. Okay, so Richard.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we didn't have time to talk about targets, positive action and other things of that nature, but that is essentially part of the conversation as well. I mean, I can only really echo the point about, avoiding this sense of complacency. I think picking up on one of the earlier questions, we are starting to unpack some kind of discipline-specific issues, and really the only way we're going to be able to address them is to continue to sit down and have some quite difficult conversations, to share what works and what doesn't work, and to actually accept that some degree of experimentation is probably required. So in that respect, it's very gratifying to see everyone on a sunny day coming to this seminar and willing to engage in that debate. So thank you.
Thanks, Catherine.
I'd just like to, I guess, congratulate you on bringing this group together and starting that conversation. I guess my question would be, how do you continue that, and what are the lessons you can learn from other institutions, other fora, whether it's around data and information, whether it's around targets, whether it's around sponsorships or comment programs. We're keen to work with. I sit on the UKIRK advisory board here at Imperial, and we have a secondee at the moment from Imperial, which is proving invaluable. So the extent that we can continue to work together in these areas, I think it's really important. Maybe we should be doing more on diversity and inclusion together as well. So thank you for the opportunity.
Okay, and I think we can say we'd be delighted to continue that conversation. Hyacinth, last comments from you?
Thank you. Well, thank you very much. I'm really delighted that Imperial is hosting this seminar. I think that alone is very important. Imperial's excellence means it by default has a leadership role, and I think that diversity and inclusion has to be a core part of leadership. I guess my hope is that the people who aren't here in this room and wouldn't have made the time to come also become engaged in that effort. It has to be something where there is a collective recognition that we cannot continue with the status quo, and as others have said, this is not just going to drift into a self-correction. So there are risks to the community if we can't tackle this, but there are also opportunities if we get it right. And it goes without saying the Academy would be delighted to support in any way we can.
Okay, well, look, thanks very much. I think we should thank all the panel members, but also yourselves. There is a modest lunch outside, so do please take the opportunity to talk in person to each other and to the folk here. So please, thank you again.
No.